What if everything you were taught about the Apache Wars was only half the story? What if the people history labeled as rebels were actually fighting for something far more human? Their homes, their families, their survival. For decades, textbooks simplified this conflict into a clean narrative: civilization versus resistance, expansion versus obstruction, order versus chaos. But history is rarely that simple. In the burning deserts of the American Southwest, a small group of Apache warriors managed to outmaneuver one of the most powerful military forces on Earth, not because they had better weapons, not because they had bigger numbers, but because they understood something deeper. They understood the land, they understood patience, and they understood what it means to fight only when there is no other choice. This wasn't just a war over territory. It was a collision of cultures, a test of endurance, and a story that still raises uncomfortable questions today. Were the Apache enemies of progress? Or were they defending something we all claim to value: freedom? By the end of this video, you might see this chapter of history very differently. And I want you to do something as you watch. Don't just listen. Ask yourself, if your home, your traditions, and your people were threatened, what would you do? Would you resist? Would you negotiate? Would you leave? Drop your honest answer in the comments before the video ends. I'm genuinely curious where you stand, and I read every single one. Because this story isn't just about the past, it's about human nature, and that part hasn't changed at all. Let's begin. In the mid-19th century, when the United States expanded into the Southwest, the Army stepped into exactly that kind of environment. And what they encountered there wasn't a conventional army waiting in formation. It was something far more adaptive. By the way, where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments. It's always fascinating to see how far these historical stories travel. And if you're interested in deep dives like this, the parts of history that rarely make it into textbooks, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one. Okay, so the year was 1861. While much of the country was consumed by the Civil War, a different kind of conflict was unfolding in the Arizona and New Mexico territories. What historians now refer to as the Apache Wars was not a single war, but a prolonged and shifting series of campaigns, skirmishes, and resistance efforts that stretched across nearly 3 decades. But even calling it a war can be misleading. Traditional warfare implies organized armies facing one another in defined battles. What unfolded in the Southwest was far more complex. U.S. forces trained in conventional military doctrine suddenly found themselves facing opponents who operated by entirely different principles. Reports from officers at the time describe a recurring pattern. Columns advancing through desert terrain would lose contact, patrols would disappear, and tracking efforts would produce almost nothing. Not because there was no trace, but because they didn't yet know how to read the land. One officer stationed near the Chiricahua Mountains wrote in a dispatch that fighting in the region rendered much of his formal military education ineffective. He noted that the opposing fighters did not mass in large formations, did not defend fixed positions in predictable ways, and did not engage according to European battle traditions. Instead, they used mobility, terrain knowledge, and patience as primary weapons. And that distinction matters. The Apache were not a single centralized nation, but a network of related groups, including the Western Apache, Chiricahua, Jicarilla, Mescalero, and Lipan, each with their own leadership structures and territories. What they shared was an intimate understanding of one of the most unforgiving landscapes in North America. To outside observers, it could seem almost impossible. Fighters appearing from elevated rock positions, striking quickly, and then vanishing into terrain that cavalry units struggled even to cross. General George Crook, one of the few U.S. commanders who studied Apache tactics seriously and later worked alongside Apache scouts, acknowledged how different this conflict was from conventional warfare. He observed that Apache fighters required no extended supply lines in the traditional sense, could travel extreme distances across arid terrain, and adapted constantly to changing conditions. This wasn't random chaos, it was a strategy built over generations. From a young age, Apache children were trained in physical endurance and environmental awareness. Survival skills weren't extracurricular, they were foundational. Running long distances across rough terrain, identifying edible plants, tracking subtle movement across stone or sand, these were daily realities, not specialized skills. Silence was a discipline, stillness was a discipline, observation was a discipline. Some oral histories and later interviews with Apache scouts describe solitary endurance trials in the mountains, periods of isolation intended to strengthen resilience and mental focus. Whether every account followed the same pattern or not, what's clear is that psychological readiness was as important as physical capability. For U.S. cavalry units accustomed to structured battlefields, this created a profound tactical gap. That gap became undeniable in July 1862 at Apache Pass, a vital water source in southeastern Arizona. Control of water in desert territory wasn't symbolic, it was survival. A column of approximately 120 cavalry troops moved through the pass, confident in their numbers and weaponry. Opposing them were Apache fighters under leaders including Mangus Coloradus and Cochise. By conventional metrics, the Army held the advantage: manpower, formal training, and modern firearms. But conventional metrics didn't apply here. As the column entered the narrow terrain of the pass, fire erupted not from the obvious approach routes, but from elevated rock formations above. Positions that U.S. troops had not anticipated as viable were in fact carefully chosen vantage points. From those heights, Apache fighters controlled visibility, angles, and timing. Survivor accounts later described confusion, not because the troops lacked courage, but because the battlefield itself had been misunderstood. What appeared quiet was not empty. What appeared secure was already calculated. And this moment marked something important. It forced the U.S. military to confront a hard truth. They weren't simply fighting an opposing force, they were confronting a style of warfare built entirely around terrain mastery, mobility, and asymmetry. Concepts that modern military theory would later formalize, but that had already been practiced for generations in the Southwest. And this was only the beginning. The exchange at Apache Pass revealed something deeply unsettling for the U.S. troops involved. According to survivor testimony, the pattern was consistent: sudden bursts of accurate fire from elevated positions, followed by silence. Not retreat, not surrender. Silence. Return fire from the cavalry was often ineffective, not due to lack of effort, but because they were firing at rock faces, shadows, and positions they could barely identify. In the opening minutes of the engagement, casualties mounted quickly. Horses panicked, formations broke apart. Then, just as abruptly as it began, the firing would stop. For the soldiers inside the pass, the quiet became its own weapon. Several accounts from the period describe how troops were left scanning ridgelines, staring at empty stone, fully aware that they were being watched. The uncertainty forced commanders into impossible decisions: remain stationary and risk being surrounded, or move forward into terrain already proven dangerous. When movement resumed, the pattern repeated: fire from above, confusion, silence again. The entire engagement lasted hours, yet the actual gunfire occurred in short, concentrated bursts. That rhythm, strike, withdraw, observe, would later be recognized as a hallmark of highly disciplined guerrilla strategy. It's important to pause here and separate myth from analysis. Apache fighters were not operating randomly, nor were they relying on luck. Their advantage came from preparation and environmental control. Elevated positions provided not only better firing angles, but visibility over movement patterns. Narrow terrain limited cavalry mobility. Water access dictated timing. From a military theory perspective, this was textbook asymmetric warfare, decades before the term existed. And the psychological toll may have been just as significant as the physical losses. One surviving officer later wrote that the most disorienting part of the battle wasn't the gunfire itself. It was the sense of being studied, the feeling that every movement was anticipated. This dynamic reappeared in later encounters. In 1872, during operations near the Mogollon Rim, a cavalry patrol pursued a small Apache group into mountainous terrain. The pursuit lasted several days. What initially appeared to be a fleeing party turned out to be a controlled withdrawal. By the fourth day, the pursuing patrol found itself in a canyon with limited exits. Only then did they realize that the smaller group they had chased had likely been guiding them toward pre-selected terrain. Elevated positions once again shifted the advantage. Accounts from officers who served under General Crook suggest that these situations forced a gradual shift in military thinking. Rather than viewing Apache fighters as disorganized raiders, commanders began to recognize structured planning, coordination between bands, and deliberate manipulation of terrain. This was not improvisation, it was doctrine, just not written in textbooks. One concept frequently referenced in both military reports and oral histories is the idea of the war trail. This was not a single raid, but an extended operation involving mobility, intelligence gathering, supply coordination, and precise timing. Preparation could take weeks. Scouts observed patrol schedules. Water routes were mapped mentally, not on paper. Cached supplies, hidden stores of food, weapons, and tools allowed movement across vast distances without the slow, vulnerable supply lines that burdened conventional armies. U.S. reports from the mid-1870s describe raiding parties covering extraordinary distances across southern Arizona and New Mexico. What confused American officers was not just the speed, but the unpredictability of direction. Instead of following expected retreat routes into Mexico, some parties moved deeper into territories considered secure. Strikes occurred when patrol presence was minimal. By the time response units mobilized, the raiders had already dispersed. And here's where the psychological dimension becomes critical. Apache warfare was not solely about inflicting casualties. It often aimed at destabilizing confidence, demonstrating access, demonstrating awareness. Some soldiers reported waking to find small personal items missing from camp, objects taken without violence during the night. Whether every account is fully verifiable or partially shaped by fear, the effect was real. It created the perception that nowhere was secure. In military psychology, this is called dominance of initiative. When one side dictates when engagement happens and when it doesn't, the other side operates reactively. Over time, that reactive posture erodes morale. To American forces trained in structured formations and visible battle lines, this conflict demanded a completely different mindset. Victory would not come from larger numbers alone. It required adaptation. And adaptation would take years. By the mid-1870s, some U.S. commanders began incorporating Apache scouts into their own operations, recognizing that understanding terrain and mobility was not optional, it was survival. The Southwest conflict was quietly reshaping American military doctrine. But for the soldiers living through it in real time, it didn't feel like doctrinal evolution. It felt like walking through territory where the rules had changed and no one had explained the new ones. As the conflict continued into the 1870s and 1880s, another pattern began appearing in soldiers' accounts, not just physical confrontation, but psychological strain. Several diaries and letters from cavalry units describe unsettling incidents inside camp perimeters, personal items missing, objects rearranged, signs that someone had entered the camp without triggering alarms. Whether every detail can be verified exactly as written is difficult to determine. Battlefield narratives often amplify fear, but what matters is the impact those incidents had on morale. One private wrote that the most disturbing realization wasn't the loss of possessions, it was the awareness that someone had been close enough to take them and chose not to attack. From a strategic standpoint, that's not random intimidation, it's controlled signaling. Apache fighters understood something that modern military psychology later formalized. Uncertainty weakens cohesion. If soldiers begin to question their own security systems, their confidence erodes. If they believe they are being observed without being able to respond, stress compounds. Some patrol reports mention subtle markers left along trails, objects slightly moved, tracks intentionally revealed and then concealed. These may have served practical communication purposes within Apache groups, but to pursuing troops, they felt like deliberate reminders. You are being tracked. That perception alone could exhaust a unit before a single shot was fired. By the 1880s, figures like Geronimo had become central to the final phase of Apache resistance. Born Goyal, his name later became widely known during campaigns involving both Mexican and American forces. Geronimo's strength wasn't in commanding massive armies, he rarely did. Instead, he relied on mobility, fragmentation of forces, and timing. Small groups could strike in multiple locations, creating the impression of a much larger presence. When response units consolidated to counter one threat, activity would shift elsewhere. To commanders accustomed to fixed engagement zones, this was deeply frustrating. General George Crook, who both fought against and later negotiated with Apache leaders, repeatedly emphasized the difficulty of engaging an opponent who refused predictable patterns. Concentrated forces moved too slowly. Smaller detachments became vulnerable. The imbalance wasn't mystical, it was structural. Apache warfare integrated terrain knowledge, decentralized leadership, and rapid communication. Warriors were trained to operate independently, yet coordinate fluidly when needed. That flexibility allowed them to dissolve and reform as circumstances changed. Spiritual preparation also played a role, not in a supernatural sense, but in psychological conditioning. Ceremonies, rituals, and guidance from spiritual leaders reinforced focus, discipline, and resilience. A fighter who believes deeply in his preparation tends to act with greater confidence under pressure. Modern combat psychology recognizes similar principles. Mindset influences performance. Medicine men contributed not only spiritually but practically. Knowledge of desert plants, wound treatment, hydration strategies, and survival techniques sometimes proved effective in conditions where conventional military medicine struggled. Accounts from officers note surprise at recovery rates in environments where infection and dehydration were constant threats. Beyond direct engagement, intelligence gathering became a decisive factor. Apache groups maintained awareness of troop movement through observation networks, scouts, and sometimes informants. At the same time, misinformation could spread in the opposite direction. Patrols occasionally acted on incomplete or inaccurate intelligence, pursuing trails that led nowhere or into disadvantageous terrain. One of the most striking late campaigns occurred in 1879 to 1880 under a leader named Nana. By that point, Nana was already elderly, yet he led a mobile force across parts of New Mexico and Texas in a campaign that exposed ongoing weaknesses in U.S. response coordination. With a relatively small group, Nana's force covered remarkable distances in a short time frame. They avoided decisive confrontation, struck when opportunity presented itself, and disengaged before larger units could consolidate. Military reports from the pursuit described exhaustion, confusion over routes taken, and difficulty predicting movement patterns. Superior numbers and equipment did not automatically translate into control. In later reflections, some officers acknowledged a hard truth. The advantage lay not in weapon quality, but in familiarity with terrain and flexibility of doctrine. The Southwest was not a conventional battlefield. It was a living environment shaped by climate, scarcity, and generational adaptation. Those who grew up within it possessed instincts that could not be learned in a few campaigns. And as the 19th century moved toward its final decades, the conflict was slowly shifting again toward negotiations, forced relocations, and the closing chapter of open resistance. But the lessons learned during those decades would quietly influence American military thinking long after the fighting ended. Because what the U.S. Army encountered in the Southwest wasn't chaos, it was a different system, one that operated on speed, intelligence, terrain mastery, and psychological leverage. And it forced a powerful institution to adapt. By the mid-1880s, sustained resistance had narrowed to a final group under Geronimo. From 1885 to 1886, a relatively small band moved across the U.S.-Mexico borderlands, pursued by thousands of troops, including U.S. cavalry, Apache scouts allied with the Army, and Mexican forces. The scale of the pursuit compared to the size of the resisting group revealed how seriously federal authorities viewed the situation. In September 1886, Geronimo surrendered to General Nelson Miles at Skeleton Canyon. It's often said that Geronimo was never defeated in battle, but that framing simplifies a far more complex reality. By that point, resources were depleted, families were exhausted. Continuous pursuit made long-term survival increasingly difficult. Surrender was not theatrical, it was strategic, shaped by circumstances that left few alternatives. What followed is critical to understanding the broader story. After the surrender, Geronimo and many Chiricahua Apache, including scouts who had served alongside the U.S. Army, were transported as prisoners of war to Florida, then Alabama, and later Oklahoma. The conflict may have ended militarily, but the human consequences continued for decades. This phase forces a difficult reflection. The Apache Wars were not simply clashes between two armies, they were part of a larger national expansion that displaced indigenous nations across the continent. Tension often escalated due to broken treaties, competition over land and water, mining expansion, and inconsistent territorial governance. Historians still debate specific incidents, including raids attributed to one side or the other, but what is well documented is that cycles of retaliation, miscommunication, and political pressure frequently undermined peace negotiations. The conflict did not persist because one side was incapable of negotiation. It persisted because trust collapsed repeatedly. Interestingly, the prolonged fighting also reshaped the U.S. military itself. Over 3 decades of campaigning in the Southwest, officers were forced to adapt. Large, slow-moving formations proved ineffective in rugged desert terrain. Gradually, doctrine shifted toward smaller, more mobile units. Tracking skills improved. Greater emphasis was placed on endurance, reconnaissance, and environmental survival. The Army increasingly relied on indigenous scouts who understood the terrain far better than officers trained in Eastern academies. That cooperation, while complicated, influenced future military thinking about irregular warfare and decentralized operations. By the early 20th century, many of the lessons learned in the Southwest, mobility, adaptability, environmental conditioning, had become standard components of military training. History often works this way. Conflict produces adaptation. Adaptation becomes doctrine. Doctrine shapes the next generation. There's also a symbolic irony that later American paratroopers adopted the name Geronimo as a battle cry during World War II. A name once associated with resistance against U.S. expansion became integrated into American military identity. That transformation says something about how history absorbs its adversaries. As for the veterans who survived the Apache campaigns, many left behind letters reflecting on the difficulty of the conflict, not only physically, but morally. Some wrote about exhaustion, others about respect for the skill of their opponents. A few acknowledged that what they had witnessed was not simply warfare, but the closing of an era. By the late 19th century, the Southwest had changed permanently. The Apache were not erased, they endured, adapted, and continued to preserve their culture today, but their autonomy over ancestral lands had been drastically reduced. And that may be the most important takeaway. The Apache Wars were not a story of ghosts or myths. They were a collision between expansion and resistance, between centralized power and decentralized survival knowledge. They forced one of the most powerful militaries in the world at the time to rethink how warfare could be fought, not through sheer numbers, not through spectacle, but through mobility, intelligence, terrain mastery, and psychological resilience. And when you zoom out, that legacy didn't disappear in 1886, it evolved. In the decades after the Apache Wars ended, stories lingered. Campers spoke about eerie echoes in canyons. Hikers described the feeling of being watched in remote terrain. Ranchers found tracks that seemed to appear and disappear in shifting sand. But these stories say more about landscape memory than about literal ghosts. The Southwest is vast, isolated, harsh. When you walk through narrow desert passes at dusk, it's easy to imagine the past layered over the present. History feels close there, not because spirits remain, but because the terrain hasn't changed. And the people haven't vanished either. The official military conflict ended in 1886. Geronimo surrendered. The Chiricahua Apache were imprisoned and relocated. Federal authorities declared the resistance over. But culture does not end when a war ends. Today, Apache communities continue to live in Arizona, New Mexico, and Oklahoma. Language, ceremony, family lineage, and traditional knowledge have survived despite enormous pressure. The idea that the warrior tradition disappeared misunderstands what that tradition actually was. It wasn't constant fighting. It was discipline, endurance, environmental knowledge, mental resilience, community loyalty, strategic thinking. Those qualities don't vanish, they evolve. Historians widely acknowledge that the U.S. Army's prolonged campaigns in the Southwest forced institutional change. Over time, doctrine shifted toward smaller unit mobility, long-range reconnaissance, environmental survival training, greater emphasis on physical conditioning, and integration of scouts familiar with local terrain. These adjustments weren't adopted out of admiration, they were adopted out of necessity. When a powerful institution spends decades struggling in a specific environment, it studies that environment, it studies the tactics used against it, It adapts. That's not conspiracy, that's military evolution. There is also symbolic weight in the fact that Geronimo later became a rallying cry among American paratroopers in World War II. A name once associated with resistance became absorbed into national military identity. History does that sometimes. It transforms adversaries into symbols. But beneath that symbolism lies a harder truth. The Apache Wars were not just military engagements. They were part of a larger national expansion that reshaped the continent at enormous human cost. Land was taken, autonomy was reduced, communities were uprooted. At the same time, the resilience displayed during those decades left a permanent mark on American military thinking. The Apache demonstrated something that modern strategists now take for granted: a small, disciplined, highly adaptive force, deeply familiar with its terrain and unified by purpose, can challenge a numerically superior opponent for far longer than conventional theory predicts. That lesson echoes far beyond the 19th century. But perhaps the deeper lesson is not about warfare at all. It's about adaptation. The Apache survived one of the harshest landscapes in North America for generations before the U.S. Army ever arrived. They adapted to environmental extremes, they adapted to invasion, they adapted to imprisonment, and their descendants continue adapting today. The mountains still stand, the desert still stretches across Arizona and New Mexico. But the story is not one of ghosts hiding in caves or secret warriors waiting in shadows. It's a story of cultural endurance, of how knowledge can survive displacement, of how discipline forged in hardship can outlast the conflict that created it. And maybe that's the part history textbooks don't always emphasize. Empires expand, wars end, but resilience, real resilience, doesn't disappear. It carries forward. Now, history students, military analysts, and cultural scholars still study the Apache Wars today, not to romanticize conflict, but to understand resilience, adaptation, and survival under extreme pressure. In those desert mountains and canyons, generations of Apache families developed knowledge of terrain, mobility, and community defense that challenged a far larger military force. That history is not about hidden conspiracies or secret powers. It's about how people, when pushed to the edge of survival, learned to endure. One of the most important truths often overlooked is this: the Apache were not erased, they negotiated, they were relocated. They endured overwhelming pressure, broken agreements, and enormous hardship. But their culture survived, their identity survived, their people survived. Geronimo did not surrender because he lacked courage. He surrendered because continued fighting would only bring more suffering to his community. There is a difference between being destroyed and choosing preservation. More than a century later, the deeper question is not who won, but what did this conflict cost? Land was taken, communities were displaced, lives were lost on all sides. Families, Apache and American, carried trauma for generations. History is rarely a simple story of good versus evil. It is a complex web of fear, ambition, misunderstanding, survival, and human frailty. The Apache Wars were shaped by expansion, cultural collision, and political forces much larger than any single warrior or soldier. When we revisit this chapter of history, we should do so with humility. Not to rewrite the past into heroes and villains, not to inflame modern divisions, but to learn. The Apache people fought to protect their homes and traditions. U.S. soldiers believed they were serving their nation, Both realities existed at the same time, and acknowledging complexity is not weakness, it's maturity. For those of faith, this story invites reflection. Scripture calls believers to seek justice, love mercy, and walk humbly. When we examine history honestly, including moments of injustice and suffering, we are not dishonoring our nations. We are strengthening them by telling the truth with compassion. Jesus taught love of neighbor. He taught mercy over pride. He taught that true strength is not domination, but sacrifice. When we apply those principles to history, we see that the real lesson is not about battlefield tactics, it is about dignity. The Apache legacy is not violence, it is endurance. It is cultural survival. It is identity preserved against immense pressure. And that legacy still lives today in language, traditions, families, and communities who continue to thrive despite the weight of history. The goal of remembering this story is not to glorify war. It is to understand how conflict shapes people and how resilience shapes generations. The mountains remain. The stories remain, the people remain. If this history moved you or challenged how you see the past, share your thoughts below. What lessons do you think modern societies should learn from conflicts like this? Let's talk about it respectfully. History doesn't disappear, it waits. It waits in archives, in family stories, in land that remembers footsteps long after the footprints fade. The Apache Wars were not just a chapter in a textbook. They were lived experiences, real people, real loss, real courage, real consequences. And maybe that's the uncomfortable part. Because when we look closely, this isn't just about the 1800s. It's about power. It's about identity. It's about what happens when two worlds collide and neither one fully understands the other. Some people will say this was a story of expansion. Others will say it was a story of resistance. Some will call it inevitable. Others will call it tragic. So here's the question I want you to sit with. Was this conflict unavoidable, or were there moments where everything could have gone differently? I want your honest take. Not the safe answer, not the textbook answer, your answer. Do you believe history is driven more by greed, fear, survival, or misunderstanding? Drop one word in the comments that you think best explains this conflict, and explain why. I'll be reading through them, and I'm curious to see which word shows up the most. Because conversations like this matter. They help us move beyond simple narratives. They help us think critically. They help us grow. If this story challenged you, share it with someone who loves history, and let's see what they think too. The past can't be changed, but how we understand it, that's still in our hands. I'll see you in the next one.